My own son called my life's work hoarder junk, thinking I was just a frail old woman he could easily fool. He brought a shady art dealer into my home, planning to sell my entire legacy for pennies on the dollar, all while smiling and telling me it was for my own good. But what my ungrateful son didn't know is that his clueless mother was a legend the entire art world feared, and I was about to serve him a very public lesson he would never ever forget. My own son called my life's work hoarder junk, thinking I was just a frail old woman he could easily fool. He brought a shady art dealer into my home, planning to sell my entire legacy for pennies on the dollar, all while smiling and telling me it was for my own good. But what my ungrateful son didn't know is that his clueless mother was a legend the entire art world feared, and I was about to serve him a very public lesson he would never, ever forget. There's a certain rhythm to a Sunday dinner that's been happening for 40 years. It lives in the familiar weight of my cast iron skillet, the scent of rosemary and garlic that seeps into the wooden walls of my small house, and the particular way the late afternoon sun slants across the dining room table. But last Sunday, the rhythm was off. My son Leo was the reason. He was a whirlwind of manufactured helpfulness, a trait so foreign to his usual relaxed nature that it felt like a costume. He insisted on clearing the table while I was still halfway through my roast chicken. He scrubbed pots with a frantic energy, his expensive watch getting splattered with soap suds. And he talked relentlessly about one topic: my house. More specifically, the things inside it. He kept using the word declutter. He said it with the bright, brittle enthusiasm of a salesman suggesting that all the things I loved, the things that made up the texture of my life, were somehow a problem to be solved. He called my collection of paintings and sculptures an awful lot of stuff for one person, his eyes scanning the walls not with appreciation, but with the cold calculation of an auctioneer. There was an agitation to him, a current of anxiety running just beneath his smiling sun facade. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. Later, while I was wrapping the leftover chicken, he stepped onto the back porch to take a call. I could hear his voice through the screen door, low and strained, and it was his wife, Sarah. He was trying to sound reassuring, but his words were tight, like a rope pulled taut. He mentioned closing a big deal, something that would solve everything. He said he just needed a little more time, that everything was going to be fine, but his voice cracked on the word fine. A man who is truly fine doesn't have to announce it with such desperation. I saw him swipe at his phone screen, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flash of red on the screen, a notice angry and overdue with a number so large it didn't seem real. He swiped it away before I could make sense of it, his shoulders slumping for just a second before he straightened them again, the mask of the successful provider snapping back into place. After he left, the house felt strangely quiet, the echo of his anxiety still lingering in the air. I walked through my living room, my sanctuary. To Leo, it was clutter. To me, it was a history book of my life. I ran my hand over the rough, cool surface of a small bronze sculpture, a gift from a dear friend in the 70s, an artist nobody had heard of back then. I smiled at a small, chaotic, abstract painting on the wall, remembering the day a young, paint-splattered visionary had traded it to me for a hot meal and a bottle of cheap wine. Every single piece was a conversation, a memory, a piece of a soul, mine and the artist's. They weren't just things. They were my family, my legacy. They were the quiet companions of my widowhood. I was about to head to bed when I heard Leo's car pull back into the driveway. I peeked through the curtains, confused. He wasn't getting out. He was just sitting in the dark, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. I couldn't help myself. I crept to the kitchen window, which was slightly ajar, catching the night breeze. I could hear his voice, but this time it was different. It was smooth, conspiratorial, all the earlier strain gone. And then I heard the words that stopped my heart. "Don't worry," Leo said into his phone, his voice dripping with a casual, dismissive confidence. "She has no idea what any of this is worth. It's just hoarder junk to her." That night I didn't sleep. The hurt from my son's words was a physical thing, a shard of ice in my chest. But as the hours passed, sitting in the deep silence of my house, surrounded by my so-called junk, that ice didn't melt. It spread. It hardened. The warmth of a mother's wounded feelings froze over, becoming something cold, clear, and sharp. Fury. A quiet, patient fury that didn't need to scream because it knew it would be heard loud and clear when the time was right. By dawn, the plan had formed not in a flurry of emotion, but with the crystalline precision of a frost pattern on a window pane. Betrayal clears the mind wonderfully. There's a phone number I haven't dialed in over a decade, but my fingers remembered it just as my mind did. It belongs to a man named Arthur Vance, a lawyer of the old school who knows more secrets than a priest. He was my late husband's friend, and more importantly, he was the only other person on earth who knew what the Magpie really was. His voice was gravelly with sleep when he answered. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I just said the words, and I felt a tremor of my old self return as I spoke them. "Arthur," I said, my voice steady and low. "It's Magpie time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a slow, deep chuckle. He knew what it meant. I gave him his instructions, specific and non-negotiable. There is a sculpture in my living room tucked away on a bookshelf. It's a small thing, a gnarled piece of bronze that looks a bit like a twisted seed pod. To most, it's an odd paperweight. To a connoisseur, it is the seed, the very first significant work by Maria Flores, created long before she became a legend. I knew from the way Leo had described the gallery owner, a man named Julian Vance, specializing in mid-century masters, that the seed would be the crown jewel he was hunting for, the piece that proved the rest of the junk was a treasure trove. Arthur was to have it picked up by a secure courier and placed in his firm's vault within the hour. He asked no questions. That's why I trusted him. 2 days later, they arrived. Leo was wearing his best suit, a forced smile plastered on his face. The man beside him, Julian, was sleek and modern, dressed in expensive black clothes. He had the eyes of a shark circling, sensing a meal. He gave me a condescending smile, the kind you give a child or a pet, before his gaze immediately began to devour the room. He was trying to appear casual, but his eyes darted from piece to piece, his hunger barely concealed. Leo launched into his overly loud, cheerful monologue about how Mr. Vance was just going to have a quick look around to appraise a few things. Julian's eyes landed on the bookshelf. He scanned it, then scanned it again. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He walked over his expensive shoes, silent, on my old wooden floors. He leaned in his gaze, tracing the empty space where the seed used to sit. "You mentioned an early Flores," he said to Leo, his voice losing its smooth edge. "A small bronze." Leo's smile faltered. "Yes, of course it's right. Here." He pointed to the spot. His finger hovered in the empty air. The blood drained from his face. What it was? It was right there. I saw it on Sunday. His head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with the first glint of genuine panic. Mom, where is it? The little bronze thing. Where did you put it?" I arranged my face into a mask of benign confusion. I let my brow furrow and my eyes go a little vacant the way he expected them to. "Which one, dear? I have so many little things." "The seed pod!" he almost shouted, his voice cracking. The facade of the calm, practical son shattered into a million pieces. "The ugly little brown one. It was right here, Mom. Where is it? Think." His tone was sharp, accusatory. the false sweetness of the past week completely gone. Now I was just a doddering old fool who had misplaced the key to his salvation. I let my eyes well up with convincing tears. Leo, why are you yelling at me? I don't know. Maybe I moved it when I was dusting. I can't always remember where I put things these days. You know that. I looked so frail, so helpless, so utterly useless. I could see the war in his eyes, the desperate need to find the sculpture warring with the sudden, awful realization of how this looked to his buyer. He was berating his confused elderly mother. Julian watched the exchange with cold, unconcealed annoyance. He had no time for this messy family drama. He came for a quick, profitable kill, not a scavenger hunt in a hoarder's house. He turned to my son, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur that I was clearly not meant to hear. "You told me this was straightforward," he hissed. "You told me she was a non-factor." He took a step back, straightening his designer jacket, as if to brush off the dust of my chaotic life. He looked at Leo, then at me, then back at Leo. "I'll wait in the car," Julian said, his patience clearly evaporated. "You have 5 minutes to sort this out." As he passed my son, he added one final quiet warning, a hook that snagged Leo right through the gills. "No more surprises." Leo came back inside a few minutes later, the swagger gone, replaced by a performance of strained solicitousness. He had the gall to bring me a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as he offered it. He apologized for his tone, blaming it on stress from work and his worry for me. It was a masterful little play. He was no longer the aggressive interrogator, but the concerned son, gently explaining that Mr. Vance was a very important man, and this was a very important opportunity. He explained that a preliminary offer had been made, a number that he presented as a life-changing windfall, enough to fix my leaky roof and hire a full-time caregiver so I wouldn't have to be alone in this big, cluttered house. He laid the documents on my dining room table, a sales agreement. Thick, official, and predatory. He'd had them ready the whole time. My signature was the only thing missing. His voice was soft, coaxing, the way one might speak to a frightened animal you're trying to lure into a cage. He just wanted me to be safe, to be secure. He was doing this all for me. The lies were so thick, I felt like I could choke on them. I looked at the papers, then at his desperate, pleading eyes. I let my shoulders slump. I sighed, a long, weary sound that felt like it came from the bottom of my soul. I told him it was all too much for one day. I told him I needed to think. For a moment, I saw a flash of his real frustration, but he smothered it quickly, replacing it with a look of profound patience. "Of course," he said, "I should take all the time I need." But he added gently, Mr. Vance wouldn't wait forever. The relief on his face when he left was palpable. He believed he had won. He thought he had corralled his confused, emotional mother back into her pen, and that with a little time she would sign on the dotted line. He had smoothed things over. He had no idea he had just handed me the match. The moment his car was out of sight, I felt the performance of the frail old woman fall away from me like a snake shedding its skin. I walked to the old secretary desk in the corner, the one my husband gave me 50 years ago. To anyone else, it's just a piece of antique furniture. But I opened the bottom drawer, which appears to be full of old tablecloths, and lifted a false bottom. Nestled in the hidden compartment was a sleek, modern laptop, its surface cool and clean. I opened it, and the screen glowed to life, asking for a password. I typed it in integrity. The screen bloomed into a simple text-based interface. Across the top, in stark white letters, were 2 words, "Welcome, Magpie." You see, Agnes is the woman my son knows. The Magpie is the woman I am. I created her in 1973. The art world back then was a gentleman's club, and a woman's opinion on art was treated as a charming little hobby. My critiques were rejected time and again until, out of sheer frustration, I submitted one under the ambiguously male name A. Crow. It was published. So I built a legend around a name, a phantom critic who saw the truth and wasn't afraid to print it. The Magpie built careers and tore down frauds. The Magpie became a ghost, a myth, a kingmaker whose words could cause the value of a painting to soar or plummet overnight. Artists I championed when they were starving, like Maria Flores, became titans. I never took a dime. The power was the point. The integrity was the point. For 40 years I kept the secret. And now my son, in his blind, desperate greed, was about to bring the ghost back to life. My phone buzzed. It was Arthur. His voice was grim. He confirmed what I already knew in my gut. Julian Vance was a vulture. He had a reputation in the circles that still remembered the Magpie. He specialized in estate acquisitions, which was a polite term for finding desperate families and buying their inherited treasures for pennies on the dollar before a proper appraisal could be done. He was a bottom feeder with good taste. Arthur told me that Julian had been sniffing around my name for months, likely tipped off by some local rumor that the reclusive widow of John Miller had a few nice things. And my own son had rolled out the welcome mat for him. "So the plan proceeds?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "It proceeds," I confirmed, my eyes on the screen. I opened a new document. At the top, I typed the title for my regular column, the one that the entire art world from New York to London to Tokyo still read every single week. Midweek Musings by the Magpie. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the quiet clicks the only sound in the room. It was time to remind the world what happens when you try to cage a bird. I didn't have to wait long. The Midweek Musings by the Magpie drops every Wednesday at precisely 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It has for 30 years. It's a tradition, a ritual in the art world. I wrote the piece with surgical care. I never mentioned Julian Vance's name. I never mentioned Asheville. I never even mentioned a specific collection. I didn't have to. The professionals, the ones who mattered, would know. My article was a quiet academic dissection of a particular type of predator, the gallery vulture. I wrote about how they prey on the elderly and the grieving, using family desperation as a cover for acquiring generational treasures. I described their method, the feigned sympathy, the quick lowball offer, disguised as a generous rescue, the reliance on the family's ignorance and the owner's perceived frailty. I called it the gentle art of the swindle, a quiet violence committed with a fountain pen and a condescending smile. I wrote about the sacred trust between an artist and a collector, and the profound ethical stain left by those who would turn a lifetime of passion into a quick, dirty commodity. The piece was elegant, intellectual, and utterly damning. I pressed publish at 8:59 a.m., and I imagined a silent digital shockwave rolling out from my little house across the country and over oceans. For a few hours, there was only silence. Then my phone rang. It was Arthur. His voice was electric with a kind of grim excitement. The post was on fire. It was being forwarded from gallery assistants to museum curators, from auction houses in London to private collectors in Hong Kong. The comments were a torrent of speculation. Who was the Magpie writing about this time? Which vulture was about to be plucked? The whispers had begun. The trap was set. The sound of a car screeching into my driveway was my next cue. Leo burst through the front door without knocking, his face as white as a sheet. He was holding his phone in his hand like it was a venomous snake he was forced to carry. His hair was a mess, his tie was loosened, and the confident swagger of the man who had brought me sales documents was completely gone. In its place was a raw, primal panic. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He didn't speak at first, just stalked towards me, where I sat in my armchair sipping a cup of chamomile tea. He shoved the phone in my face. On the screen was my article, the stark black text of the Magpie's website, looking alien and menacing on his device. I could hear a man's furious, tinny voice screaming from the phone's speaker. It was Julian. I could just make out the words sputtered in a rage. He was accusing Leo, asking if his mother was talking to the press, if she knew something, if this whole deal was some kind of setup. Leo finally found his voice. It was a ragged whisper. "What is this?" he asked, his eyes wild and desperate. "What did you do?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I looked from his terrified face to the phone screen and then back again. I let the silence stretch, letting him drown in it. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, level, and utterly devoid of the motherly warmth he had known his entire life. "A critic's first duty is to the art," I said softly. "Not the artist, and certainly not the seller." I watched the gears turn in his head. I saw the confusion, the frantic attempt to connect the dots. He looked from me, his doddering old mother in her floral armchair, to the ruthless intellectual prose on the screen. He remembered the stories, the legends of the art world he'd heard over the years, the mysterious anonymous critic who held more power than any museum director, the Magpie. The name was a myth, a ghost. And then I saw the moment it clicked. The moment the impossible, unthinkable truth crashed down upon him. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly greenish pallor. The anger in his eyes dissolved, replaced by something I had never seen there before: fear. True, abject fear. He was no longer looking at his mother. He was looking at a monster from a fairy tale, a ghost made of flesh and blood sitting right in front of him. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered and reformed with me at its absolute center. He sank onto the sofa opposite me, the phone slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering onto the floor. "You—" He breathed the word, a puff of air. "It's you, all this time." He started pleading, then the words tumbling out of him in a desperate, incoherent torrent. He talked about the debt the house, what Sarah would do if she found out. He begged me to take the article down to make a call to fix it. He told me I didn't understand what was at stake. I let him finish. I waited until his desperate pleas trailed off into whimpering silence. I placed my teacup carefully in its saucer, the tiny click echoing in the still room. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "The sale is tomorrow, isn't it?" I wasn't there to see it myself. I didn't need to be. The Magpie has always worked from the shadows. My lawyer Arthur painted the picture for me later, his voice rich with the satisfaction of a flawlessly executed plan. It was exactly as I had designed it. The gallery was a symphony of smug success. Champagne flowed, tiny, elaborate appetizers were passed on silver trays, and the self-congratulatory chatter of Asheville's art elite filled the high-ceilinged room. At the center of it all was Julian Vance, preening like a peacock. He was celebrating his latest acquisition, my life's work, which he had rebranded as the Lost Collection of the Blue Ridge. He was selling a story, a fantasy of his own discovery. My son Leo stood near the back, looking pale and anxious, a ghost at a feast he had arranged. He was trying to network, but his eyes kept darting towards the door, a man waiting for a guillotine he couldn't see. At precisely 7:30 p.m., Arthur Vance walked in. He is an imposing man in his late 70s with a shock of white hair and a gaze that could make a statue nervous. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply took a position near the large projector screen at the front of the room and waited. A few minutes later, Julian stepped up to a small podium, tapping a microphone to a chorus of applause. He began his speech, a river of self-aggrandizing nonsense about his eye for hidden genius and his passion for rescuing forgotten art. As he paused for dramatic effect, Arthur gave a subtle nod to a technician he'd hired for the evening. The main gallery lights dimmed, and the projector flickered to life. Julian smiled, thinking it was his own presentation starting, but it wasn't his logo that appeared on the 10-foot screen. It was the stark, iconic letterhead of the Magpie. And then the title of the review, in letters a foot high, "The Vulture of Asheville." A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones began to light up as people scrambled to the Magpie's website. My words, my cold, precise judgment filled the screen for all to see. The review was a masterpiece of literary destruction. It started by detailing with cold, hard numbers the predatory nature of the deal for my collection, an offer of $150,000 for works valued conservatively at over $1 million. It laid bare the method, the targeting of a senior citizen, the exploitation of a family's manufactured desperation. But I didn't stop there. Arthur's team had been busy. The review went on to expose with documented proof two of Julian's past triumphs. It detailed the Elm Street estate, where he had convinced a grieving widower to sell his late wife's pottery collection for less than 10% of its auction value. Then it detailed the Carter acquisition, where he had pressured a family facing catastrophic medical bills into selling a priceless collection of folk art. He wasn't a collector. He was a predator who followed the scent of tragedy. Gasps filled the room. The murmuring turned into loud, shocked whispers. Julian's face, projected in the light from the screen, had turned to ash. His smug smile had melted into a mask of slack-jawed horror. He was being vivisected in public, his reputation stripped away line by devastating line in front of his clients, his peers, and his rivals. Then came the kill shot. A well-known Charlotte banker, Julian's biggest and most influential client, stood up. His face was a thundercloud. He pointed a finger at the trembling man on the podium, his voice booming through the stunned silence. He declared their partnership over, effective immediately, and announced that his lawyers would be in touch regarding their past dealings. That was it. The dam broke. The event descended into chaos. People were talking loudly, backing away from Julian as if he were radioactive. His career wasn't just over. It was a smoking crater. In the midst of this beautiful, controlled chaos, my focus was on my son. As the crowd erupted, Arthur saw Leo shrink back against the far wall, his face a mess of confusion and terror, and at that exact moment, I sent him a text message. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He read the 6 words I had sent him. Arthur said it was the strangest thing. In a room full of noise and shouting, Leo seemed to go completely silent and still. He looked at the words on his screen and his face just broke. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the failed deal or the public humiliation. It was the quiet, personal truth of that message delivered from his own mother. He had been so focused on the value of the art that he had forgotten the value of the person who created it. He stumbled out of the gallery, not triumphant, not relieved, just a man hollowed out by the full weight of his own choices. He wasn't a victim of his mother's revenge. He was simply facing the consequences he had earned. Back at my house, the only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. The chaos of the gallery was a world away. On the table in front of me sat the seed, the small bronze sculpture I had saved from the wreckage. Its surface was cool and solid beneath my fingertips. It was a victory, yes. Justice had been served cold and clear. But it wasn't a celebration. It was the somber end to a painful chapter. a necessary amputation to save the rest of the body. I had protected my legacy, but I had broken my son to do it, and I knew as I sat there in the quiet of my home that some victories feel an awful lot like loss. The days that followed the gallery event were quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and ringing silence. The world I knew was buzzing. Arthur kept me updated on the fallout. Julian Vance was a pariah. His gallery was a toxic asset, his name a cautionary tale whispered in the art communities of 2 continents. He had simply vanished undone by a few thousand well-chosen words. There was a cold, clean satisfaction in that, the feeling of a predator being removed from the ecosystem. But my thoughts were not with Julian. They were with my son. Leo didn't call for 3 days. I knew he needed the time to let the wreckage of his life settle around him. I learned later from my daughter-in-law Sarah what happened in those first few hours. Leo had gone home from the gallery, walked into his perfect house, and confessed everything. He told her about the failed business, the mountain of secret debt, the second mortgage, the impending foreclosure. He told her about his plan to sell my art, his betrayal born of terror and shame. He laid all his failures at her feet, expecting her to leave, but she didn't. Stripped of all the lies that had been poisoning their marriage, they found something real in the ruins. They would face it together. The bankruptcy, the foreclosure, the loss of the life they had built. It would be a humbling, painful process, but it would be an honest one. For the first time in a long time, there were no more secrets between them. That in itself was a kind of victory I had never intended. When Leo finally called me, his voice was almost unrecognizable. It was stripped of all its usual confidence, all its patronizing warmth. It was thin, raw, and heavy, with a shame so profound I could feel it through the phone line. He wasn't calling to ask for money or a bailout. He wasn't calling to blame me. He just called to apologize. He spoke in broken sentences, his voice catching as he tried to explain the desperation that had driven him. He apologized not just for trying to sell the art, but for never seeing it in the first place. For looking at my life's passion and seeing only junk, a resource to be liquidated. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in 20 years. I didn't offer easy forgiveness. I just listened. It was the first step on a long road, but it was a step he had taken on his own. He was finally taking accountability. Meanwhile, the art world continued to spin. My unsold collection had become something of a legend overnight. The story of the Magpie's dramatic return and the public takedown of a gallery vulture was the juiciest gossip in years. My little house in Asheville was now the location of a mythical treasure trove. The irony was not lost on me. A week ago, it was a hoarder's den. Now, it was a landmark. The calls started coming in mostly from reporters, all of whom Arthur politely turned away. Then came a call from the director of a major reputable museum. She didn't ask about the Magpie, she asked for Agnes Miller. She had heard about the collection, about its unique history and personal significance. She spoke of its importance, not its monetary value. She wanted to know if I would consider allowing the museum to host a special exhibition, not to sell it, but to share it, to honor it, to tell its story and mine. The useless junk my son had tried to offload for a quick buck was being offered a place of honor to be appreciated by thousands. I accepted. A week later, Leo came over. He didn't use his key. He knocked on the front door and waited for me to let him in. We sat at the dining room table, the same one where his frantic energy had first set off my alarm bells. There were no documents between us this time. He looked older, tired, but the frantic fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, somber quiet. We didn't talk about the debt or the house. We talked about a small, abstract painting on the wall. He asked me who the artist was. I told him the story of the young man who traded it for a hot meal. For the first time, my son listened. It was awkward and painful, like resetting a bone that had healed incorrectly. But it was the beginning. We were no longer a dismissive son and his frail, underestimated mother. We were just two adults sitting in the quiet wreckage trying to figure out if anything of value could be built from it. In the quiet that followed the storm, Agnes came to understand that the true value of a thing, be it a painting or a person, is never found on a balance sheet. Her son, blinded by the desperation of his circumstances, saw only junk to be liquidated. He failed to see a life, a history, and a passion laid bare in front of him. In the end, she did not punish him. She simply held up a mirror to his choices. The consequences were already his. And that she knew is what real justice looks like, not a weapon of revenge, but the unavoidable reflection of the truth.